My husband served me divorce papers at a restaurant. Days later, a judge froze his $2.8 million. My husband handed me divorce papers mid-dinner. Days later, the judge froze his $2.8 million accounts. There was $2.8 million my husband thought I'd never find. A judge froze it 4 days after he asked for a divorce. My husband planned the perfect exit. The restaurant. The table, even the wine. Everyone asks what I did when he served me divorce papers. The envelope was stark white. Standard size. The kind you'd use to mail a birthday card to a cousin you don't particularly like. It landed on the white tablecloth between the breadsticks and my wine glass with a sound I can still hear, a soft, flat thud, like Marcus had been practicing how to set it down without looking dramatic. He didn't say anything at first. I was mid-sentence. I think I was talking about the trip we'd half planned to Portugal, Lisbon in May, maybe a few nights in the Algarve. I had actually been excited. And then the envelope was just there. Between us. And Marcus was looking somewhere slightly past my left shoulder, the way a person looks when they've rehearsed what they're about to do so many times that the actual moment feels oddly mechanical. I looked at the envelope. Then at him. Then back at the envelope. I picked it up. And here's the thing nobody tells you about a moment like that: your brain doesn't scream. It doesn't flood with adrenaline or go white with shock the way they show it in movies. Mine went very, very quiet. Like every unnecessary frequency just dropped out, and all that was left was the sound of the restaurant around me. Low jazz, the clink of someone's fork on porcelain 2 tables over, Marcus breathing, and the specific, deliberate rustle of papers sliding out of a manila envelope that had my full legal name printed across the top of the first page. Petition for dissolution of marriage. Calloway vs. Calloway. Filed, March 14th. I read the first paragraph. Then the second. I set the document face down on the tablecloth. I reached for my wine glass, a 2019 Barolo that Marcus had ordered, which, I noted somewhere in the back of my mind, cost $72 a bottle, and I took one long, slow sip. And I said nothing. I want you to remember that detail, because that silence, that single, deliberate sip, is the moment this entire story turned. Not the envelope. Not the filing date. Not the fact that we were sitting in Carmine's, a restaurant we'd been to 17 times in 9 years, surrounded by white tablecloths and low candlelight, and 2 other couples who I now realized were staring very carefully at their appetizers. Not any of that. The turn was the sip. Because Marcus had spent months, as I would later learn in very precise and documented detail, building what he believed was an airtight exit. He had moved money. He had restructured assets. He had consulted a lawyer. He had planned this dinner, this specific restaurant, this specific table, this specific company, because he believed that serving me papers in public, in front of friends, would be enough to keep me too humiliated to think clearly. What Marcus did not know, sitting across from me in Carmine's on a Friday night in March while I quietly finished a sip of a $72 Barolo, was that I had already been watching him for 6 months. And I had already found everything he thought he'd hidden. That should have been the end of it. The quiet wife, the clean exit, the pre-planned settlement Marcus had probably already outlined with his attorney over lunch somewhere. It wasn't. My name is Renata Calloway. I'm 41 years old. I live in Charlotte, North Carolina, in a house I helped design, in a neighborhood I helped choose, on a street where, for 9 years, the neighbors knew me as Marcus's wife before they knew me as anything else. I want to be honest about that. I let it happen. Not because I was weak, but because I was busy letting other parts of my life shrink quietly, the way a room gets smaller when you keep rearranging the furniture instead of admitting the walls have moved. By training, I'm a certified public accountant with a specialization in forensic auditing. I spent 11 years at a mid-size firm in Charlotte, the kind of firm that gets called in when a company suspects an executive has been skimming, or when an estate goes to litigation and nobody can agree on what the assets actually were, or when a business partnership dissolves badly and both sides are certain the other one is lying about the numbers. My job, for over a decade, was to find what people hid. Not dramatically. Not like a detective in a procedural. More like, I would sit with a set of financial records and I would read them. The way you'd read a letter written by someone who was choosing their words very carefully. You learn, after enough years, that money has a grammar. It has habits. And when something is off, when a number is in the wrong place, or a transfer happens at an unusual time, or an account grows and then quietly empties in a pattern that doesn't match the stated business activity, you feel it before you can fully explain it. I left the firm when I was 36 to build my own financial consulting practice. Smaller clients, more selective work, better hours. By the time Marcus handed me that envelope at Carmine's, I had 14 active clients, a reputation in Charlotte's financial and legal community that I had built entirely on my own, and a home office with 3 monitors and a filing system that my assistant once described as, honestly, a little unsettling. I tell you all of this not to impress you. I tell you because I need you to understand the specific, almost cosmic miscalculation Marcus made when he decided that the best way to leave his wife was to financially outmaneuver her. His wife, who had spent 15 years professionally dismantling the financial deceptions of people far more sophisticated than a commercial real estate developer from Charlotte, North Carolina. I loved Marcus. I want to be clear about that, because this story is not about hatred. When I met him at a mutual friend's birthday dinner in 2014, I was 29, he was 34, and he had this way of listening to you like you were the only person in the room who'd ever said anything worth hearing. I fell for him in that slow, certain way that you fall for someone you actually believe in. We built something together. Or I thought we did. And then, slowly, almost imperceptibly, I started noticing things that didn't add up. Not emotionally. Not at first. Financially. And if you know anything about me by now, you know that financially is exactly the wrong place to start lying to Renata Calloway. I told myself, for longer than I should have, that I was being paranoid. That I was letting my professional instincts bleed into my personal life. That not every discrepancy is a deception. But then I built the spreadsheet. And the spreadsheet told me something different entirely. Have you ever ignored something because understanding it would cost you too much? Not because you were stupid. Not because you were naive. But because you had built an entire life around a version of a person, and dismantling that version meant dismantling everything attached to it, the house, the plans, the identity, the future you'd already half furnished in your mind. That's where I was for about 3 years. Choosing, carefully and deliberately, not to see. The first thing I noticed was the LLC. In 2020, Marcus and I had co-signed onto a business entity together, a property holding company called Storytime Partners LLC. It was his idea, structured around 2 commercial properties he was developing in the University City area of Charlotte. I was listed as a co-member. I had signed the operating agreement at our kitchen table on a Tuesday night in October, while a pot of tomato soup was going on the stove and Marcus was already moving on to the next document before I'd finished reading the one in front of me. I remember thinking, briefly, that I should slow down. Read everything carefully. That's literally what I do for a living. But Marcus said, "It's standard, Renata, I've been over it with the attorney," and I let the soup distract me. I initialed where he pointed. I trusted him. 18 months later, a contractor named Dale Hutchins called my cell phone on a Wednesday afternoon asking about an outstanding invoice for $23,400 in site preparation work on one of the University City properties. He'd been trying to reach someone at Storytime for 6 weeks. He had my number because I was still listed as a co-member on the original filing. I pulled up the LLC records that night. Storytime Partners had been quietly amended in early 2021. A registered agent change. A membership restructure. My name was no longer listed as a co-member. I had been removed from the operating agreement without my signature, without my knowledge, and, as I would later confirm with an attorney, without legal authorization. I paid Dale Hutchins his $23,400 out of my own account. And I filed that conversation, and that payment confirmation, in a folder on my desktop that I labeled, very calmly, discrepancies. The second thing was the joint savings account. We had maintained a joint savings account at First Horizon since 2016. It was our long-term account, the one we'd earmarked for a second property, maybe a renovation, eventually whatever came next. At its peak, in the spring of 2021, it held just over $180,000. By January of 2023, it held $34,200. I found out the way you find out about most financial slow bleeds, not in one shocking moment, but in a quiet Tuesday morning review when the number on the screen simply doesn't match the number in your memory. I pulled the transaction history. 17 months of transfers, ranging from $4,000 to $18,500, all initiated from Marcus's linked profile, all categorized in the memo field as business reinvestment. When I asked Marcus about it at dinner one evening, casually, carefully, the way I'd learned to ask things I actually needed answers to, he said the commercial market had required faster capital deployment than expected. He said it with the particular patience of someone explaining something to a person they've decided is slightly slow. He said, "You know how development cycles work, Renata." I did know how development cycles worked. That was precisely the problem. Because the transfer pattern I was looking at did not match any development cycle I had ever seen in 15 years of financial consulting. It matched something else entirely. It matched a pattern I had seen twice before in my career, once in a partnership dissolution case, and once in a contested estate audit. It matched the pattern of someone methodically moving money to somewhere their spouse couldn't see it. I didn't say that at dinner. I nodded. I said, "Right, of course." I refilled my water glass. And that night, after Marcus fell asleep, I opened my laptop and I started building the spreadsheet. The third thing was smaller. More personal. And in some ways, it cut the deepest. There was a dinner party at our friends David and Claire's house in November of 2022. 8 people around a long oak table, good wine, the kind of evening that should have been easy. Someone asked me about a municipal bond situation in the news, a Charlotte City project that had run into some financing trouble. It was exactly the kind of thing I work with regularly. I started explaining the underlying structure, the way the debt was collateralized, why the city's approach had created a liquidity problem that was entirely predictable if you looked at. Marcus put his hand over mine on the table. He said, "She's been reading too many spreadsheets. Don't get her started." And the table laughed. Politely. The way people laugh when they're not sure if something was a joke or a dismissal, and they'd rather assume joke. I smiled. I finished my sentence, quieter than I'd started it. But I remember the specific weight of his hand over mine. The way it felt less like affection and more like a lid being placed over something. I think about that moment now and I understand it differently than I did then. Marcus had spent years, by that point, making small consistent investments in a particular version of me, the version that was decorative, supportive, present but not prominent. The version that could be handed an envelope at a restaurant and be too destabilized to think straight. He had been, in his patient and deliberate way, preparing the terrain. What he hadn't accounted for was that I had been preparing too. I didn't start the spreadsheet because I wanted a divorce. I started it because something in 15 years of professional instinct simply would not let the numbers rest. I kept pulling threads because that is who I am, at the most fundamental level, regardless of what version of me Marcus had decided to invest in. By the time he slid that envelope across the white tablecloth at Carmine's, my spreadsheet had grown to 84 rows across 6 tabs. And every single row had a source document attached. I remember the exact moment I realized this wasn't paranoia anymore. It was a Thursday evening in February, about 5 weeks before the dinner at Carmine's. I was on my third monitor, cross-referencing a property tax record in Mecklenburg County with a business filing I'd pulled from the North Carolina Secretary of State database. I found a company name I didn't recognize. And then I found another one. And then I found the third. That was the moment everything shifted. Let me take you back to Carmine's. Because I gave you the broad strokes in Chapter 1, but I need you to understand the full architecture of what Marcus built that evening. Because it wasn't just a dinner. It was a production. And the more I understood that, the more clearly I could see exactly what kind of man I had been married to for 9 years. He had made the reservation 2 weeks in advance. I know this because I later checked our shared calendar, where he had entered it as dinner with DNC and Arentit, David and Claire, and our other friends Ryan and Tessa. 6 people total. A corner table at Carmine's, which Marcus had specifically requested, according to the hostess I spoke to afterward, because it offered a bit more privacy. He had told them before we arrived. I figured this out in the first 4 minutes, from the way Ryan wouldn't look at me directly when we walked in, and the way Tessa hugged me 2 seconds too long at the greeting, the way you hold on to someone when you already know something bad is about to happen to them. David was talking slightly too loudly about something inconsequential. Claire had ordered a second drink before the appetizers came. They all knew. Marcus had called them, I later confirmed, individually, in the week before the dinner. He had told them the marriage had run its course. He had used that phrase, run its course, with every single one of them, like he'd workshopped it for softness. He had asked them to be there because, I believe, he calculated that my dignity in front of people I cared about would do the work his lawyer had told him sharp paperwork alone might not do. He wanted me contained. He wanted the presence of friends to act as a social pressure system, a reason for me not to raise my voice, not to ask difficult questions, not to be anything other than a woman gracefully absorbing a blow in public. And to his credit, it almost worked. When I opened the envelope and read the first 2 paragraphs of the petition, there was a moment, maybe 3 seconds long, where I felt the floor drop out from under me in a very specific way. Not grief, exactly. More like vertigo. The sensation of a fixed point you'd been using to orient yourself suddenly no longer being where you thought it was. Marcus leaned forward slightly. He said, quietly, across the breadsticks. I've already talked to a lawyer, Renata. I want you to know I'm proposing a fair split. This doesn't have to be ugly. And there it was. The line he had practiced. The reasonable, measured, pre-packaged reassurance designed to make me feel like my best option was to nod and cooperate and trust his definition of fair. I looked at him for a moment. I thought about the $180,000 savings account that now held $34,200. I thought about Dale Hutchins and his $23,400 invoice. I thought about the 3 LLCs I had found in the Secretary of State database 5 weeks earlier, none of which Marcus had ever mentioned to me, all of which had been established using funds that passed through accounts I had partial visibility into, all of which were sitting on assets that I was now almost certain he intended to exclude from any marital estate calculation. I thought about my 84-row spreadsheet with 6 tabs and every source document attached. And then I excused myself to the restroom. I walked through the warm amber light of Carmine's, past the bar, past a table of women celebrating something with Prosecco, and into the single-occupancy restroom at the back of the restaurant. I locked the door. I stood at the sink for a moment and looked at myself in the mirror. I did not cry. I took out my phone and I typed one text message to a woman named Gloria Tran, forensic accountant, former IRS examiner, and the most methodical human being I have personally ever encountered in a professional context. The text said, "He filed. We need to move. Monday morning." Gloria responded in 40 seconds. She said, "I'll have the full report formatted by Sunday night. It's 47 pages. He's not going to enjoy it." I put my phone back in my bag. I walked back to the table. I sat down. I smiled at Tessa, who looked like she might be sick. I picked up my fork. I finished my osso buco, which was, genuinely, excellent. I made appropriate conversation for the remaining 40 minutes of the dinner. I thanked David and Claire for a lovely evening. And I let Marcus drive us home, talking the whole way about how he hoped we could handle this maturely, while I sat in the passenger seat of a car I had helped pay for, in a marriage I had helped build, on a foundation I now knew had been quietly hollowed out beneath me for years. I said very little on the drive home. I was already thinking about Monday morning. That was the last evening Marcus Calloway spent believing he was the most prepared person in this situation. He wasn't. He never had been. I need to explain something about forensic financial work before I tell you what Gloria and I found, because I think it matters for understanding why what Marcus did was not just morally wrong, it was strategically catastrophic. When most people hide money in a marriage, they think about the hiding. They think about where to put it, how to move it, what to call it. They spend a great deal of energy on the destination. What they rarely think carefully enough about is the path. Money leaves a path. Every transfer, every filing, every registered agent, every tax document, every deed, every rental agreement, all of it creates a trail of breadcrumbs that, to the untrained eye, looks like a pile of unrelated paperwork. But to someone who knows how to read it, to someone like Gloria, or like me, it reads like a map. A very specific, very detailed map that leads directly back to every single thing you tried to hide. Marcus had been building his exit for approximately 26 months. That was Gloria's assessment, based on the earliest anomalous transfer she could trace, a $31,000 wire in January of 2022 to a business account belonging to an entity called Harrow and Vance Capital LLC, registered in Delaware, with a registered agent address that turned out to be a mail forwarding service in Wilmington. Harrow and Vance Capital. I had never heard that name in 9 years of marriage. I want you to let that sit for a second. 26 months. While I was sitting across from this man at dinner, while we were making half plans about Portugal, while I was building my consulting practice and trusting the version of our life that he was presenting to me, he had been, for over 2 years, systematically constructing a financial architecture designed to ensure that when he left, I would have as little as possible. Gloria's 47-page report identified 3 distinct entities. The first was Harrow and Vance Capital LLC, the Delaware holding company. It existed primarily as a pass-through, a layer of distance. Its primary function appeared to be receiving transfers and redistributing them to the second entity. The second was Piedmont Residential Group LLC, registered in North Carolina, with Marcus listed as sole member under a slightly varied version of his middle name. Piedmont held 2 residential rental properties in Raleigh, a 4-bedroom in North Hills and a 3-bedroom near NC State. Combined, they were generating approximately $8,400 per month in rental income. Marcus had owned these properties for 19 months. I had never been told they existed. The third was the one that made my breath catch when Gloria walked me through it on that Sunday evening, sitting at my kitchen table with her laptop and a yellow legal pad and 2 cups of coffee that went cold before we touched them. Lakeview Commercial Holdings LLC, also registered in North Carolina, also Marcus as sole member. Lakeview held a single asset, a 2.3-acre commercial lot in Mecklenburg County, purchased in August of 2022 for $1.1 million. $1,100,000. Purchased 11 months before Marcus handed me that envelope at Carmine's. Funded, in traceable part, by transfers from our joint savings account, the same account that had dropped from $180,000 to $34,200 during what Marcus had described to me, with great patience, as business reinvestment cycles. That $1.1 million lot, per a commercial real estate appraisal Gloria commissioned, had appreciated. It was now worth approximately $1.4 million. Gloria put her pen down and looked at me across the kitchen table. She said, "Renata, including the rental properties, the Mecklenburg lot, the estimated liquid assets in Harrow and Vance, and the original Cedar interest he removed you from, we are looking at a conservatively estimated $2.8 million in marital assets that do not appear anywhere in his filing. $2.8 million. Hidden across 3 LLCs, 2 states, 19 months of rental income, and 1 very expensive piece of land purchased with money that had moved through our joint account while Marcus explained to me, patiently, that I knew how development cycles worked." I sat with that number for a long moment. And then I asked Gloria how quickly she could have her report formatted for legal submission. She said, "I told you. Sunday night. It'll be ready before you wake up Monday." What they didn't know, Marcus, his attorney, anyone on his side of this, was that the $2.8 million wasn't the leverage. The leverage was that I could prove every single dollar of it. With documentation. With transfer records. With LLC filings. With deed records. With rental agreements. With a 47-page forensic report prepared by a former IRS examiner who had spent 14 years finding exactly this kind of thing for exactly this kind of case. Marcus filed thinking he had already moved everything I couldn't find. He didn't know I had already found all of it. Every last dollar. I remember closing my laptop that Sunday night and sitting in the quiet of my home office for a few minutes before bed. The house was still. Marcus was in the other room, probably already feeling the particular lightness of a man who believes his plan is working. I turned off my desk lamp. I thought, Monday is going to be a very different kind of day than he's expecting. I was right. I need to explain something about forensic financial work before I tell you what Gloria and I found, because I think it matters for understanding why what Marcus did was not just morally wrong, it was strategically catastrophic. When most people hide money in a marriage, they think about the hiding. They think about where to put it, how to move it, what to call it. They spend a great deal of energy on the destination. What they rarely think carefully enough about is the path. Money leaves a path. Every transfer, every filing, every registered agent, every tax document, every deed, every rental agreement, all of it creates a trail of breadcrumbs that, to the untrained eye, looks like a pile of unrelated paperwork. But to someone who knows how to read it, to someone like Gloria, or like me, it reads like a map. A very specific, very detailed map that leads directly back to every single thing you tried to hide. Marcus had been building his exit for approximately 26 months. That was Gloria's assessment, based on the earliest anomalous transfer she could trace, a $31,000 wire in January of 2022 to a business account belonging to an entity called Harrow and Vance Capital LLC, registered in Delaware, with a registered agent address that turned out to be a mail forwarding service in Wilmington. Harrow and Vance Capital. I had never heard that name in 9 years of marriage. I want you to let that sit for a second. 26 months. While I was sitting across from this man at dinner, while we were making half plans about Portugal, while I was building my consulting practice and trusting the version of our life that he was presenting to me, he had been, for over 2 years, systematically constructing a financial architecture designed to ensure that when he left, I would have as little as possible. Gloria's 47-page report identified 3 distinct entities. The first was Harrow and Vance Capital LLC, the Delaware holding company. It existed primarily as a pass-through, a layer of distance. Its primary function appeared to be receiving transfers and redistributing them to the second entity. The second was Piedmont Residential Group LLC, registered in North Carolina, with Marcus listed as sole member under a slightly varied version of his middle name. Piedmont held 2 residential rental properties in Raleigh, a 4-bedroom in North Hills and a 3-bedroom near NC State. Combined, they were generating approximately $8,400 per month in rental income. Marcus had owned these properties for 19 months. I had never been told they existed. The third was the one that made my breath catch when Gloria walked me through it on that Sunday evening, sitting at my kitchen table with her laptop and a yellow legal pad and 2 cups of coffee that went cold before we touched them. Lakeview Commercial Holdings LLC, also registered in North Carolina, also Marcus as sole member. Lakeview held a single asset, a 2.3-acre commercial lot in Mecklenburg County, purchased in August of 2022 for $1.1 million. $1,100,000. Purchased 11 months before Marcus handed me that envelope at Carmine's. Funded, in traceable part, by transfers from our joint savings account, the same account that had dropped from $180,000 to $34,200 during what Marcus had described to me, with great patience, as business reinvestment cycles. That $1.1 million lot, per a commercial real estate appraisal Gloria commissioned, had appreciated. It was now worth approximately $1.4 million. Gloria put her pen down and looked at me across the kitchen table. She said, "Renata, including the rental properties, the Mecklenburg lot, the estimated liquid assets in Harrow and Vance, and the original Cedar interest he removed you from, we are looking at a conservatively estimated $2.8 million in marital assets that do not appear anywhere in his filing. $2.8 million. Hidden across 3 LLCs, 2 states, 19 months of rental income, and 1 very expensive piece of land purchased with money that had moved through our joint account while Marcus explained to me, patiently, that I knew how development cycles worked." I sat with that number for a long moment. And then I asked Gloria how quickly she could have her report formatted for legal submission. She said, "I told you. Sunday night. It'll be ready before you wake up Monday." What they didn't know, Marcus, his attorney, anyone on his side of this, was that the $2.8 million wasn't the leverage. The leverage was that I could prove every single dollar of it. With documentation. With transfer records. With LLC filings. With deed records. With rental agreements. With a 47-page forensic report prepared by a former IRS examiner who had spent 14 years finding exactly this kind of thing for exactly this kind of case. Marcus filed thinking he had already moved everything I couldn't find. He didn't know I had already found all of it. Every last dollar. I remember closing my laptop that Sunday night and sitting in the quiet of my home office for a few minutes before bed. The house was still. Marcus was in the other room, probably already feeling the particular lightness of a man who believes his plan is working. I turned off my desk lamp. I thought, Monday is going to be a very different kind of day than he's expecting. I was right. I want to be very precise about what I did next, and what I did not do. I did not confront Marcus. I did not cry, or threaten, or hint, or give him any signal whatsoever that the terrain had shifted beneath him. I understand that for some people, in some situations, the confrontation is necessary. It's cathartic, it's honest, it closes something. But I am a forensic auditor by training and temperament, and I have watched, in a professional context, what happens when someone who has been quietly building a case tips their hand too early. The subject adjusts. They move assets. They get better attorneys. They coach witnesses. They create distance between themselves and the documentation. I was not going to tip my hand. So for the 10 days between that Sunday night with Gloria and the moment the legal machinery began to move, I went about my life with extraordinary normalcy. I made coffee in the morning. I worked. I came home. I had dinner with Marcus twice, during which he was warm and reasonable in the practiced way of someone who believes they are managing a situation cleanly. He mentioned his attorney once, said the paperwork was straightforward, suggested we might want to agree on a mediator to keep things out of court. I said that sounded reasonable. I was, during this same 10-day period, doing the following. On day 2, I retained Patricia Osei, a family law attorney in Charlotte with a specific background in high-asset divorce litigation and financial fraud cases. I had asked 2 colleagues independently for a recommendation without explaining why, and both gave me Patricia's name without knowing the other had done so. That felt significant. I called her office on a Monday morning at 8:47 a.m. When I sat across from Patricia and walked her through Gloria's 47-page report, she was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "Renata, this is not a complicated divorce case. This is a marital fraud case that happens to have a divorce attached to it. These are very different things." She explained what that meant in practical terms. In North Carolina, marital fraud, the deliberate concealment of marital assets during divorce proceedings, is taken seriously by family court judges. It is the kind of thing that does not simply result in a corrected asset schedule. It results in sanctions. It results in adverse inferences. It results, in documented and egregious cases, in judges awarding the defrauded spouse a disproportionate share of the very assets that were hidden. It also, Patricia explained carefully, results in something called a motion for asset preservation, a formal legal request, supported by evidence, asking the court to freeze the relevant accounts and assets pending a full forensic audit, specifically to prevent further dissipation or concealment. Given Gloria's report, Patricia believed we had more than sufficient grounds. On day 4, Patricia filed our response to Marcus's divorce petition. Attached to that response was a formal request for financial discovery, every business record, every LLC filing, every bank statement, every transfer record for the preceding 36 months, and the motion for asset preservation. On day 6, a judge reviewed the motion and Gloria's supporting report. On day 7, the order was granted. A temporary restraining order was issued, freezing Marcus's personal accounts and the accounts associated with all 3 LLCs pending a full court-ordered forensic audit. $2.8 million. Frozen. I was in my office when it happened. I was on a call with a client about something entirely unrelated, a municipal financing question, actually, which I found almost funny in retrospect, when my phone buzzed on the desk with a text from Patricia that said simply, "Order granted. Served this morning." I finished my client call. I thanked them. I said I'd follow up with a summary document by end of week. And then I sat in my office chair for about 90 seconds and I breathed. Marcus called at 11:14 a.m. Then 11:17. Then 11:22. Then 11:25. 4 calls in 11 minutes. I watched my phone light up on the desk each time, and each time I let it go to voicemail, and I thought about a dinner table in November 2022 and the weight of a hand placed over mine and a voice saying "Don't get her started," and I thought about a manila envelope landing on a white tablecloth with a soft, flat thud, and I thought about Dale Hutchins and his $23,400 invoice, and the $180,000 that became $34,200, and a commercial lot in Mecklenburg County that Marcus bought with our money and put in a company I wasn't supposed to find. On the fifth call, I answered. There was a silence on the line for just a moment. Like he hadn't fully expected me to pick up. Then he said, "Renata. What did you do?" And his voice had lost something. That particular, practiced patience was gone. What was underneath it was something rawer and less composed, and I recognized it because I had heard that exact quality in a voice before, in depositions, in conference rooms, in the moment a person realizes that the story they have been telling about their own situation is no longer the story everyone else is working from. It was the sound of someone realizing they had miscalculated. Badly. I said, "Marcus, I followed the money. Just like you taught me." And I ended the call. I want to be clear that I did not feel triumphant in that moment. I felt something more complicated and more honest than triumph. I felt the specific, exhausting relief of a person who has been quietly holding an enormous amount of weight finally being allowed to set it down. I felt grief, still, underneath everything. Grief for the marriage I had believed in, for the man I thought I had known, for the version of our future I'd had to quietly bury somewhere around the 40th row of an 84-row spreadsheet. But I also felt, for the first time in a very long time, completely and fully like myself. Forensic auditor. Financial consultant. Woman who reads the numbers and trusts what they tell her. The most prepared person in the room. The one Marcus had forgotten to account for. Patricia called me that afternoon with a list of next steps. Marcus's attorney had already reached out. The tone, she said, had changed considerably from the initial communications. I'll bet it had. What came next was the part Marcus had never planned for, because he had never genuinely believed it was possible. The part where the accounting came due. The forensic audit took 11 weeks. I want you to understand what 11 weeks of court-ordered financial scrutiny looks like for a person who has spent 26 months carefully constructing a hidden financial architecture. It is not pleasant. It is not quiet. It does not allow for the kind of calm, managed narrative that Marcus had been so deliberate about crafting, the reasonable man, the fair split, the marriage that had simply run its course. What it allows for is the truth. A court-appointed forensic examiner, separate from Gloria, appointed independently by the judge, spent those 11 weeks pulling every thread. Every transfer. Every LLC amendment. Every deed. Every rental agreement. Every wire. Every memo field that said business reinvestment on a transfer that had moved money from our joint account into a Delaware holding company that my husband had never once mentioned to me in 9 years of marriage. The examiner's report confirmed Gloria's findings almost precisely. 3 LLCs. 2 states. $2.8 million in marital assets that had not appeared anywhere in Marcus's initial filing. Patricia presented the examiner's report to the court alongside Gloria's original 47-page analysis and the documentation I had been quietly building for 6 months, the Cedar amendment, the savings account transfer history, the deed records, the rental agreements, the Secretary of State filings, every breadcrumb from every trail Marcus had believed was invisible. The judge was not impressed with Marcus. I will leave it at that, because I am not interested in performing satisfaction at another person's humiliation, even a person who served me divorce papers over a $72 bottle of wine in front of people we called friends. What I will tell you is what the court ordered, because the court's orders are public record and they are the only part of this story that belong to the record rather than to me. Marcus's 3 LLCs were disclosed in full and added to the marital estate. The Mecklenburg County commercial lot, the $1.4 million property purchased with funds traced in part to our joint savings account, was awarded to me outright as part of the settlement, in recognition of what the court characterized as deliberate dissipation of marital assets. I received a structured cash settlement covering my equitable share of the Raleigh rental properties and the remaining LLC assets, paid out over 18 months, secured by a court order that meant Marcus's accounts remained under judicial oversight until the final payment cleared. Patricia negotiated full reimbursement of my legal fees. Every invoice. Gloria's forensic work, Patricia's litigation hours, the court filing costs, all of it. The mutual friends who had sat around that table at Carmine's, carefully studying their appetizers while my husband handed me a manila envelope, reached out over the following weeks. David and Claire sent a card that I read once and put in a drawer. Ryan texted twice. Tessa called and left a voicemail that was so carefully worded I could tell she'd written it down first. I didn't return most of the calls. Not out of anger. I want to be precise about that. I understand that people make choices in uncomfortable situations, and most of those choices are about self-preservation rather than malice. I don't carry resentment for any of them the way I once thought I might. I simply found that, on the other side of everything, I was more selective about where I placed my energy. More honest with myself about which relationships had been genuinely reciprocal and which ones had been convenient. That clarity, it turned out, was worth more than I expected. Marcus and I finalized the divorce 8 months after he slid that envelope across the white tablecloth at Carmine's. I signed the papers in Patricia's office on a Thursday afternoon in November. Patricia shook my hand. Gloria sent a text that said simply, "Well done." I drove home. I made dinner. I sat at my kitchen table in a house that was, for the first time in 9 years, entirely, unambiguously mine. And I felt something I hadn't felt in longer than I could precisely remember. Quiet. Clean. Undiminished. I've thought a lot, in the months since, about what I would say if someone asked me what this experience actually taught me. Not about Marcus. Not about divorce, or forensic accounting, or the specific mechanics of emotion for asset preservation in a North Carolina family court. Those are details. Important ones, but details. I mean what it taught me about myself. And the honest answer is this. The most dangerous thing Marcus did was not hide the money. The most dangerous thing he did was spend years, quietly and consistently, investing in a version of me that was smaller than the real one. The version that deferred. The version that initial documents while the soup was on the stove. The version whose hand could be covered on a dinner table in the middle of a sentence she was perfectly capable of finishing. He wasn't unique in this. I want to say that clearly. The specific architecture changes, sometimes it's money, sometimes it's language, sometimes it's access, sometimes it's just the slow, patient repetition of being made to feel like the least important person in your own story, but the mechanism is the same. Someone decides, for their own reasons, that your competence is inconvenient. And they begin, slowly, to build a frame around you that makes it harder to use it. What I know now, that I wish I had known earlier, is that the frame was never load-bearing. It was always just a frame. I am a forensic auditor. I read balance sheets the way other people read novels. I notice what's hidden between the lines. I keep records. I build spreadsheets at midnight and I attach every source document and I trust what the numbers tell me even when trusting them is expensive. That was always true. It was true when Marcus put his hand over mine at that dinner table. It was true when I signed documents while the soup was on the stove. It was true when I sat in a restaurant bathroom stall for 4 minutes and texted Gloria Tran. It was true when I let 4 calls go to voicemail and answered the 5th one. It was who I was on the day I met him, and it was who I was on the day I signed the final papers in Patricia's office, and it is who I am right now, talking to you. Nobody made me that person. Nobody could unmake me either. And if you are sitting somewhere right now, in a situation where someone has spent a significant amount of time and energy convincing you that your clearest, most capable self is somehow too much, or inconvenient, or a problem to be managed rather than a person to be reckoned with, I want you to remember something. The frame was never load-bearing. It was always just a frame. And you were always the one holding the walls up. If this story resonated with you, if you've ever been underestimated by someone who should have known better, or found yourself smaller in a room you helped build, tell me where you're listening from in the comments. And if there's a boundary you've been putting off setting, a number you've been afraid to look at, a conversation you've been rehearsing but not having, maybe today is the day. You already know what you know. Trust it. If you made it to the end of this story, I genuinely appreciate you being here. If something in Renata's story felt familiar, if you recognize the pattern, or the silence, or that specific exhaustion of being the most prepared person in a room full of people who've decided not to notice, share this video with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe if you're new here. Every week I bring you stories about people who were underestimated, overlooked, written off, and what happened when they finally stopped cooperating with that narrative. Leave a comment with the one line from this story that stayed with you. And I'll see you in the next one.